Thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring a part of today's video. In today's video, I'm going to talk about the 4 couple conflict styles according to the research of John Gottman, including the one type of conflict style that you should probably avoid because it's not associated with great outcomes. And I'm also going to talk about some takeaways from this research and the one most important thing that you should consider when picking out a partner regarding your conflict styles. So the 4 styles are hostile, avoiders, validators, and volatiles. Let's get into it, starting with the one that you should probably not do, hostiles. People who have a hostile conflict style tend to communicate in verbally or emotionally abusive ways when they are getting in an argument with someone. They might be insulting, belittling, sarcastic. They lack fondness. They're not being warm towards the other person. They're simply lacking respect and regard for the other person that they're speaking to. For some reason, they're making it clear that they don't respect the other person. And usually that reason is that they probably don't. They're probably a person that's struggling to respect anyone. And they don't make up for their arguments outside of their arguments. They're not the type to make up through humor or warmth or affection afterwards or during the argument. They're actually quite characterized by the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, which I've made videos on before. The 4 behaviors that you should basically try to avoid in any relationship unless you want it to dissolve. People who are hostile in conflict do not listen to what the other person is saying. They're pretty emotionally detached. And couples who have a hostile conflict style tend to either stay together and be miserable or break up. I think hostile conflict style is what we typically think of when we think about fighting or arguing. I've made videos on how I believe that arguing is different from simply having a conflict. Personally, when I think about like an argument, I think about a hostile conflict style. And this conflict style can occur in pretty much any culture. I'm sure we all know people of many different cultures who have this conflict style. It tends to be pretty maladaptive, and it tends to be associated with personality disturbances. Conflict style number 2 is volatile. Volatile is similar to hostile in that it's quite high intensity. It might be characterized by a lot of passion and raising your voice, but it's very different to hostility in the sense that you're still expressing fondness towards the other person. You might be elevating the tone of your voice and displaying more passion about the topic at hand, but ultimately you respect the other person, you still feel affectionate towards them, you're still being warm, maybe cracking some jokes, you see them as your equal, both during the conflict and afterwards. And couples who have a volatile conflict style do tend to stay together. So it's not a problem if you have more of an increased volatility. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to break up with the other person. I think a really good example of this is, they're not a couple, but Carmela and Ro from The Sopranos. Sometimes in the way that they communicate with each other, things can get a little heated. And they're best friends, so they have a lot of fondness for each other. But sometimes when they get into disagreements, things can get just a little bit intense. I know for me as a watcher, I'm like, oh, where's this going? Is this going to end well? But it's a very brief spat characterized by increased emotionality for a moment, and then immediate remediation, warmth, and expression of care towards the other person. I do think a lot of Latin cultures have this, and I'm not just talking about Latin American, I'm talking about Latin in the sense of any culture that speaks a Romance language, including even Romanian and French. I think Latin cultures do tend to have more of a volatile conflict style, and so it's a lot more normalized. A person who's, let's say a WASP American versus an Italian American, if you put them both in a volatile conflict, they might react very differently. The Italian American might be perfectly fine with it, and the WASP might be a little bit uncomfortable. But I do wonder, and maybe you can let me know about this in the comments, where do we draw the line between this is culture and this is maybe a little bit unsafe? Because I know for me, if someone starts to raise their voice at me or is becoming a little bit volatile in their tone, I'm going to be a little bit activated. I'm going to feel a little bit triggered, and maybe that's just because of my past experiences with conflicts. But I'm not comfortable when things start to get really heated in an argument. It doesn't feel safe for me, even if the other person is not intending that to be their outcome. Let me know, what do you think about this? Where do we draw the line between culture and something that can be triggering? The 3rd conflict style is the validators. Validators are calm, they're collaborative, they cooperate with each other when they have a conflict, they express a lot of empathy, they're validating the other person's perspective, they find common ground to focus on. Personally, this is what I think about when I think about healthy conflict. Unhealthy conflict, I think of hostile or volatile, and healthy, I tend to think of validators. Do you agree? Because I think this one's the best. Validators showcase a lot of emotional maturity and respect towards the other person. They try to work together on a conflict instead of opposing each other or getting really heightened emotionally. And lastly, there is the conflict avoidance style. Conflict avoiding people tend to rarely argue. They avoid confrontation. When they do bring up something, they're very gentle with each other, but typically they tend to just focus on the common ground that they have, similar to the validators. The issue is that sometimes they can get deadlocked, meaning sometimes one person wants one thing, the other wants something else. If they're not talking about it, that can result in things never moving forward, because what doesn't get acknowledged tends to fester at times and just becomes a bigger problem. You might be hearing this and thinking, this sounds a bit passive-aggressive. And you're right that it's a little bit passive for sure, but it doesn't ever really veer into the aggressive style. Passive aggressivity is something a little bit different. Conflict avoidant is really more on just the passive side. I've seen this conflict style sometimes with people from East Asian cultures like Taiwan. They come from a more collectivistic culture where they are taught to value the other person and to put their comfort sometimes over their own, to not bring up issues that could be upsetting to the other person because they just want to focus on preserving the quality of the relationship as much as possible. And some people just don't feel comfortable experiencing conflict for whatever reason, whether it is culture or trauma or the nature of the specific relationship, like maybe the other person's in a position of power to them. And I think that it's important for us to reflect on why we have so much judgment about that, because sometimes it's not safe to have a conflict with someone who's your superior, for instance. And there's so much messaging out there, at least in the US, about, well, you should. If you have an issue, you should immediately bring it up, even if it's to your boss or to your parent or to your grandparent. But there are a lot of different reasons why it might be adaptive to avoid a conflict. Of course, like I said, there is the risk of getting deadlocked and then you're not getting your needs met. But I just think we need to be mindful and compassionate when considering our own judgments about this communication style, because there are a lot of different factors why it might be someone's go-to style. So I want to discuss some takeaways from these 4 conflict styles. But before we get into that, I want to talk about today's sponsor, Skillshare. I'm very excited to partner with Skillshare for the sponsor portion of the video, and part of the reason why is that as I move towards my last few months of internship and I'm starting to think about my postdoctoral plans, I've been thinking a lot about what kinds of moves I want to make in my career moving forward. And Skillshare can actually work with helping you towards your career goals. For instance, some of my career goals are to start my own business, to build my own website, to become my own boss, to have more financial stability, to publish a book. And you may have heard of Skillshare as a place to find courses on photography, video editing, illustration, but not many people know that Skillshare can actually be a place to help you with your career overall, no matter what your goals are. They actually have hundreds of career-focused classes on their website. Classes like building a creative career full-time or freelance, start a business and refine your branding, diversify your income, earn passive income, marketing your brand or business with video, productivity and time management, a lot of different options. So here's how you use Skillshare. When you first create an account, the website asks you for specific areas of interest, for instance, graphic design, creative writing, etc. Then they show you a few recommendations tailored to your needs, and you can also browse based on topics if you prefer. Essentially, it's like an electronic library with people who are experts in their field coming together to show you how you can learn from their level of expertise. It's a place where you can really take ownership over your career and start to learn things that otherwise would be really hard to find. The first 1,000 people to use this link that I will put in the description and in a pinned comment will get a 1-month free trial for Skillshare. So check out the link if you're interested, and let's get back to the video. The first takeaway of this topic is that there isn't one wrong or correct conflict communication style, except hostile. Hostile's wrong. Conflict isn't a death sentence for you and your relationship, unless, of course, it's riddled with the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, or it's not filled with positive aspects as well. According to John Gottman, the most important thing in determining whether you and your partner are going to make it regarding conflict style is that you have the same conflict style. The mismatch is what causes conflicts to escalate and to turn into deal breakers. And if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense. Let's think about some of the ways that it can go wrong if one person has one conflict style and another has a different one. So a validator or a conflict avoider with a hostile person, that can turn into a really abusive dynamic where one person is really trying to validate the other person or trying to avoid conflict, and the other is just escalating. That can feel really unsafe. Or a volatile with a conflict avoider, that can turn into sort of a distancer pursuer dynamic where the volatile person is trying to engage the other person emotionally and the conflict avoider is just kind of trying to run away from conflict. So of course the volatile then becomes the pursuer, the conflict avoider becomes the distancer. Or resentment can build because there just isn't that compatibility. People aren't getting their conflict needs met. One person might want to really hash it out and the other person just wants to run away from it. So that is a really important variable to consider when you're picking out a partner. And lastly, I think it just is a reminder about the role of culture and how important that can be in people's communication styles. And I think a reminder that we should all be a little bit sensitive when considering people's cultures. When somebody is speaking to us in a conflict style that we're not used to, considering could their culture be informing this? How might the history of their cultural background be informing why this is adaptive for their people? Remind yourself that this communication style evolved for a particular reason, because it was adaptive to do so in their culture. So just try to be patient. Your culture's way of communicating is not always necessarily the right way, but if your communication style is hostile, maybe it's time to work on it. Let me know what you thought about this. I'm really curious, which is your go-to conflict style? Do you agree with the idea that there isn't one correct conflict style, but rather that people just need to have a match in their conflict style? Jot that down in the comments. Thank you again to Skillshare for sponsoring this video, and I'll see you soon.